you've kind of forgotten, not forgotten, but put it in abeyance, whatever. That area under the Colorado Tailings, you know, that was a big tailings area, a great big. What, are we getting a lot of contaminated water from that area?
It's being captured in that system you were talking about. There's a capture system down there. It's capturing that water and being effectively treated.
It is, so
Yes.
That's under control, so to speak.
Yes. Actually, there have been some recent additions to that have definitely taken more copper out of the water. And you know, we've had these improvements, and now we're getting to this part that's close to being within standards, but it's flattened out. But we're still looking at trying to make that last margin.
Thank you.
Okay.
Joe, during the presentation you said that one of the things that the EPA would do in the future would be to evaluate the infiltration barriers. And I know that we really haven't discussed that among our council. Could you just briefly explain to us what you're going to do with infiltration barriers?
The question was about infiltration barriers in the study, and there's a requirement in the record of decision that since we're not removing some of those wastes, that we look at look at possible infiltration barriers, basically a cap or some other mechanism of asphalt parking on, or whatever it is. Look at some different mechanisms to try and control the amount of surface water or runoff or snow melt that sits on top and has a chance to percolate through it. It's you know, normally when you design caps, you're trying to design them with a certain slope so the water runs off, doesn't percolate through, and so that's one of the things that we're requiring them to look at. And I think we had a draft. Do we have a draft study? Or?
We do.
And so, and it's kind of going through. I think the state has provided some comments on this, some other folks, but we got to pick it up. Then it was kind of incorporated as part of the order, and so we'll have to move forward on that at some point. I think it's another one of those studies that we need. So it's basically looking at some other mechanisms to try and reduce the amount of clean water, if you will, precipitation that percolates through and becomes contaminated.
I'm Dave Williams with CTEC and the Restoration Alliance, and Pat kind of co-opted my question about the infiltration barrier. But I guess the question I had is, if you're capturing all the water, why does it matter whether or not you irrigate it or dump snow on it? Since you could make the argument that the more water you put to it, the more contaminants you're moving down to the collection system.
It can work both ways.
Yeah.
You know, it's there's a couple arguments there. If you're trying to flush the contaminants out of it, then yeah, you want to try and enhance that process. If you're trying to, you know, and as we discussed, you never collect 100%. You couldn't collect 100% of the groundwater in the area. What we're trying to do is capture enough of it so that the plume doesn't expand, it doesn't impact the creek. I mean, that or minimizes the impacts to the creek. So that's really where we're going with it. And so anything we can do to try and reduce the generation of additional contaminated groundwater is a good idea too. You know, and so trying to reduce infiltration and trying to reduce the generation of contaminated groundwater is, you know, is going to be a benefit.
Again, kind of building on what Joe and Chris said, given that there are mining sites in Europe that have been producing impacted water for on the order of 1,500 years, have EPA and ARCO done an economic evaluation of what the relative costs are for removing the Parrot Tailings, and you know, the groundwater system will clean itself up in decades, tens of decades, as opposed to essentially perpetuity. I mean, that seems like a relevant issue
to try and clean the groundwater out. Well, that was the part of the, you know, that was part of the evaluation that, you know, that we went through prior to the ROD, was trying to evaluate whether you were going to get there.
No, I mean the economic cost of doing that as compared with essentially running a treatment plant, which is going to have to be reconstructed every 20, 25 years forever.
Well, yeah, and that's the cost analysis. And once you get out, you know, in terms of when you do your present value analysis, and that's basically what you're doing, once you get out beyond a certain point, in time value of money, it stops making a lot of difference in what you would have to have today in the bank in order to provide for that treatment in perpetuity. Because as long as you assume you're gaining a certain amount of interest on the balance, you know, enough to cover the long term, once you get, and this is strictly from a cost perspective, as you're asking for, an economic analysis, once you get out beyond that point, it makes no difference in terms of today's cost, the net present value today. And so that's why the time it would take to clean up in either scenario is beyond that.
We'll do one more. We're getting towards 8:30 at this point, so I think we'll do one, or if anybody else, maybe two more questions.
I have been involved in a couple or three of your 5-year reviews, and I have come to question the whole premise of the 5-year review, because it's an internal review by one person in your office of another person's work, and basically all I have seen is that they're checking off the boxes and saying everything's okay, and you don't have anybody looking at your work and saying, why did you do this, why did you do that, who has expertise but is not beholden like your contractors are to you for their livelihood. Why wouldn't you involve something where you have a CPA looking over your bookkeeper's books? Why isn't that being done?
Well, we do on a lot of different fronts, you know, and that's where the purpose of the 5-year review is pretty specific. And it's not reviewing how good the work is of another person. It's really evaluating the remedy. You know, are there data that show that we're not being protected? You know, do we have a groundwater plume that's expanding? Do we have drinking water wells being installed in a contaminated groundwater plume? Do we have kids being exposed to mine waste that's not capped? You know, and so those are the kinds of things that we're looking at from a remedy perspective. Under the 5-year review, are we being protected? Now that's, I mean, you're right, it's EPA looking at the remedy and deciding whether or not it's protected and trying to take input, look at new data, and that's really focused on the remedy. If you're talking about other entities looking at EPA's program, you know, the Government Accounting Office does it, and the Office of Inspector General evaluates that in terms of overall processes. In terms of each remedy itself, I mean, that's just as it's EPA's job to implement the remedy in the first place and get it in place, it's also EPA's job to make sure that that stays protected. You know, and then there are other entities out there, accountants, the General Accounting Office, that look at EPA's programs to see whether or not it is doing a responsible job of getting those remedies.
Well, then why don't we see any of these reports? I haven't seen any reports from the General Accounting Office.
Well, they're out there. They're available
Well,
on
they're not on your EPA site.
any that you're interested in. As I said, it's not a review of the Butte site itself. It's kind of a review of EPA's programs, EPA's implementation, and those are available on General Accounting Office websites, the Office of Inspector General website, so we can get you that information.
All right, any other questions? All right, I think we'll call it a night then.